You're good to go, Jake.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome back, everybody. Those who were here this morning, we are starting the afternoon session of the E&E, DEQ, OWQ, CPP, and AIM Anti-Degradation Implementation Policy Stakeholder meeting. We're going to run through a little bit of the housekeeping rules like we had this morning. Your names are going to be changed to modify to show who you are. Colby has been working on that in the background. I think we're already pretty much done with that. If you would like to, when it gets to the point where we're going to allow comments and questions and open discourse, please use the chat or the raise your hand feature for those that are using Zoom. And to go into a reminder that if you're an approved stakeholder representative, that you need to provide your phone number if you're using a phone to call in. And also, for the purposes of this meeting, stakeholder representatives have commenting privileges, and the viewing public will be muted for the duration of this meeting. If you have any comments or questions, please go ahead and email the Office of Water Quality at DEQ at cpp-antideg-comments at adeq.state.ar.us. Again, that's cpp-antideg-comments at adeq.state.ar.us. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carrie. If she's unmuted.
There, can you hear?
We can hear you now.
Okay, very good. Welcome and glad to have everybody back. And we're going to just jump right into the kind of a drill down a little bit deeper on the continuing planning process. Let me see. There we go. What we're going to cover in this session is the significant differences between our current and our draft CPP and again, this is best our interpretation because they're not formatted nearly the same. And then also the significant concern to stakeholders. And again, as we interpret it, because it's kind of hard to see. And you'll see that as we go through, as I go through on the next slide, the differences between the current and the SAF, the current and the CPP. For starters, the format is a big deal. I hate to use this as a visual, but I think it really makes the point. Okay, here's the previous, our current CPP, the one we're currently using now. And we don't have a good electronic version of it. We've got variations, but for the most part, we just use our dog-eared copy of it. And as you can tell, and I alluded to this earlier, as need to meet the need and the changes needed for the CPP over time. There were just addendums and attachments. We have appendices. I know most of our permit writers live in this world right here in Appendix D. But then again, here you have attachments. So just the format alone, it really needed updating and improving upon. The draft CPP that we have proposed, and this has been made available to everybody, and it's on our website. Again, it's written more in kind of not so much a chronological order of how you would approach our planning process, but just it's more follows kind of a stream thought more than the other CPP. Like I said, and it's just kind of as needed on the last one, all the information that would be added to it. The layout of the CPP, and this is pretty much follows the table of contents that we have there. And I had gone over this briefly in our previous session, just the quick summary, is the water quality management program And that's just an overall broad view of our water quality program and how MPDS fits in, and the MPDS permitting process fits into that. The technology-based effluent limitations, how those are derived. Next, the water quality management plan, basically our tracking system of the water quality in the state has gone through permitting. Then next, the water quality based effluent limitations. And these are kind of the complement to the technology based effluent limitations. Those two processes march through to actually come up with limits and conditions for permits. Monitoring and sampling requirements, whole effluent toxicity, and the public participation and notice process. The significant differences between the current and the draft CPP, first thing of note would be the exclusions. And this is kind of a loose generalization of what's excluded, because as I alluded to in the summary in the earlier session, some of the way it was written in the current CPP, it's not necessarily cut and dried if what they're necessarily talking about. So you kind of have to read through it. But in general, surface water monitoring program, reclassification of Arkansas streams, designated management areas, water quality standards review and revision process, physical alterations of habitat, justification required for substantial and widespread economic and social impact, losing stream procedures, Arkansas water quality standards, emergency operations plan and emergency response procedures, and the construction assistance system. It'll be made clearer as we go through some of the requirements of what is actually required in the CPP, but a significant portion of these were just outside the minimum requirements of 40 CFR. For instance, the designated management areas, that's basically whose wastewater treatment plant. And that's not necessarily a requirement of the CPP, so we did not feel compelled to include it at this time. Another example would be the administrative guidance document. That's basically directions on how to change water quality criteria. And those are important and very well stated in Reg 2, but it's not a requirement, again, of the CPP as directed in 40 CFR. Additions, these are specific things that we didn't see were clear in the previous, or again, the current CPP. Non-point source controls, watershed specific requirements, no discharge, i.e. land application and subsurface permits, residual management, compliance branch, compliance schedules, technology-based effluent limits, or TBELs, use of biotic ligand model, the BLM, stormwater only discharge and short-term emergency outfall discharge, reasonable potential multipliers with the coefficient of variation table, and monitoring and sampling requirements. And again, some of these items were specifically included to fulfill the 40 CFR's requirements for a CPP. Some items and or their level of detail were at the department or DEQ, Office of Water Quality, were at our discretion. Just we felt like, even though it wasn't necessarily a requirement, we felt like it just lent itself in the thought flow of how a construction, or excuse me, a continuing planning process should be laid out. Okay, we've just covered the inclusions and the exclusions and the inclusions, the additions. And we noted some are because of the 40 CFR requirements. And this is a really important point as far as the minimum requirements of the CPP. And this is specifically laid out in the first chapter of the CPP, but we'll cover those right now. This is in 40 CFR 130.5B. And I believe if you count them all out, there's 9 of them here. And rather than expecting you to read this tiny print, the first one, luckily their nomenclature follows how it's written in 40 CFR. The procedure for developing effluent limitations and schedules of compliance at least as stringent as the federal requirements. And there's a statement that says, in referring to the appropriate regulatory requirements, that we have that in our program. The process for incorporating elements of any applicable area-wide wastewater treatment plans under 208 and applicable basin plans under the 209 of the Act. The process for developing TMDLs and individual water quality-based effluent limitations for pollutants in accordance with Section 303D. The process for updating and maintaining the water quality management plan, including schedules for revision. Item number 5, the process for assuring adequate authority for intergovernmental cooperation in the implementation of the State Water Quality Management Program. Number 6, the process for establishing and assuring adequate implementation of new or revised water quality standards, including schedules of compliance under Section 303C of the Act. Number 7, the process for assuring adequate controls over the disposition of all residual waste from any water and wastewater treatment processing. Number 8, the process for developing and inventorying and ranking in order of priority of needs for construction of wastewater treatment works required to meet applicable requirements of 40 CFR 122.44. And the last one is the process for determining the priority of permit issuance, 40 CFR 130.5B9. And that's basically the 9 requirements of a CPP. You can have more, you can have less, but those have to be in there to fulfill that portion of the regs. All right, let me see, just a second. On the significant changes of concern to stakeholders, that's the next section we're going to. We just covered the differences. And again, this is after we review and tease out the differences we can see between the two. We're trying to figure out what's of concern. And just so as you know, the majority of the things that are in the CPP are how we're actually writing permits right now and how we're actually implementing the water quality management plan. For the most part, nothing's changed in this CPP. There are a few things, and those are going to be, we'll discuss those items. But for the most part, there's nothing new that we're doing. It's just a matter of getting it documented in the CPP. So from that perspective, it's new to the CPP, but it's not necessarily new to how we're doing it. I can't quite figure out how to. There we go back. Okay. There are what we have identified here at Office of Water Quality. We've identified 6 what we would consider concerns or of interest to the public and to stakeholders specifically. And again, some folks might not consider these particularly of import, but these are what we identified. Reference to the anti-degradation implementation methodology. I list this first thing because I know this is foremost on everybody's mind. And the way we're approaching this is it's actually the anti-degradation implementation methodology is not specifically itemized and laid out in the CPP. Where we had discussed that ad nauseum as should we include it or should we not. but we felt more comfortable with it at this point as a standalone document. You know, it's new. You know, Brian had said, you know, once it's in place, we won't anticipate changing it a lot. But if there is any issues with it, we would not have to, you know, revisit the CPP. And we just see if we have the option of doing it as an entirely separate document, that we would do such. Anyway, in our introductory notes in the CPP, there's a note that anti-degradation implementation is available as a separate document, just as I stated. And then additionally, in chapter 1, where it's the broad view of our discussion of our water quality management plan, and again, this is just taken straight from the document itself. The process for determining the permit limits, as discussed in chapter 2 and chapter 4, the water quality-based limits, doesn't include the requirements of the anti-degradation implementation methodology. Before those permits are issued, it would actually go through that process, and it's actually written here as far as, you know, that would have to be considered. And just because I'm not so clever at how to do this on the on what's actually viewing on the screen, earlier I was saying that in the introductory notes prior to the actual text of the CPP, it makes a statement that it is available as a separate document. And I know this is something that we used in the previous or current CPP, that if there was a specific item that was mentioned and it was a separate document, it would just be noted as such. So anyway, so if you're looking for the actual, the anti-deg language, this is it, but the whole document itself is it's larger, it's vast, it's much more detailed, and that's what we're going to be going over in the next 2 stakeholder meetings. But anyway, that's where that is discussed, and that this is that same link to the same place. So, okay, moving on. Another item that we identified was RP multipliers. We're revisiting that. We had a kind of a broad RP evaluation for however many data points that were submitted as part of an application. And we're kind of fine-tuning that a little bit to where there's groupings of data points. If you have a small amount of data points, medium, large, you know, 10 or less, 10 to 20, 21 or greater. And that process is actually laid out in much more detail. And again, I'm just showing you that just as a indicator. It's a little bit much to go into, even at this level. It's a little bit much, but certainly we can discuss it if there's comments about it. But anyway, it's in section 4.5 of the draft CPP, and there's much discussion on how we actually would go through and evaluate for a data set of 10 or less. And again, it's submitted usually with the MPDS permit application, 11 to 20 or greater than 20. And we utilize, based on the coefficient of variations, to determine a RP multiplier. And those RPs are applied to the actual data. We don't just take the data at face value. We use this multiplier to evaluate the reasonable potential that toxic would be present. So that's something that we're kind of firming up the language on. Third item, site-specific hardness. This is my favorite because it's the most straightforward and it doesn't require a lot of thought. This is it in a nutshell. The hardness is based on table 4.6. Alternative site-specific hardness data may be considered on a case-by-case basis. That's the big addition right there. It's you know, somewhat intuitive. Great to have the receiving stream and ecoregion, but if you have site-specific, we would certainly consider that. The next one we have, and some of you might even be familiar with the situation we had on this one, but this is a specific specification of whole effluent toxicity testing requirements for short-term stormwater only discharges for acute testing instead of chronic. And this is one where it made sense to us, made sense to permittees. I think it even made sense to EPA, but EPA's comment to us during the permitting process for one of our permits said, if that is your intent, you need to include that in your CPP when you update your CPP. So that is what this is addressing here. And this is in our whole effluent toxicity section. It covers the acute, which you can't see on this page, but then we have the chronic, and then specifically we have stormwater only discharge and short-term emergency outfall discharge. I didn't mention that it's also short-term emergency outfall discharge, but it's somewhat of a similar situation. And again, these are evaluated more as acute rather than chronic. And again, I'm just pointing this out to you and where it lives, and you can read it in more detail. The next item is the use of the biotic ligand model. This is something, again, EPA has just recently been directing us towards using, and this is in lieu of hardness-based metal criteria. And it's been developed for a handful of the metals. You can see them listed here: copper, cadmium, nickel, lead, silver, zinc, and then others as I presume as they become available. And this is in section 4, our water quality based limitations. It's one of our more robust chapters in the CPP. But you can see it here as an alternative. And there's a discussion on where it came from and how it characterizes the metals. And again, this is just an addition, because we have already encountered some of these where EPA has pushed us to use these, so we wanted to include those in our CPP. And this one is just, there's nothing, I don't want to say nothing of substance here, but this is one where we're basically laying out the guidelines and examples of how we evaluate data and how it's affected by the analytical test method sensitivity. That can be, I know permittees struggle with the information that's provided as far as detection levels and that sort of thing. And we're providing a section in section 4, again, are more robust as far as how we actually evaluate the data, of mixed bag of stuff when you've got something that's reported as non-detect, but then you have something that's quantifiable, that's an achieved MQL as opposed to the required MQL, and it just shows you all the different scenarios and the different combinations that you can have and how those would be evaluated. For instance, in this case, a required MQL, and I think our example we're using is for zinc, 20 micrograms per liter, an achieved MQL of 10, and it was reported non-detect. That was what the lab felt confident was, it was non-detectable at that MQL. And in those cases, we would do no further evaluation. We would, in essence, treat it as it is not there. I don't intend to, at this point, go into all the different scenarios, but just as an example, the next scenario would be virtually the same situation, 20 micrograms per liter required MQL, an achieved of 10, but the lab specifically said the best we could do was we could say with confidence less than 10 micrograms per liter. And in a case like that, because of this versus the non-detect, we would use half of the MQL in the determination and run that through the reasonable potential factor to see if it was an issue. Oh, this is so much fun. Let's go ahead and look at the next scenario. This is one where it's a combination. We've got more than one example here, or more than one data point. Same situations with your required MQL and your achieved MQL and your reported values. In one case we had, it was actually reported less than the achieved MQL, but another one that was a greater than. And in both cases, we just go ahead and use them at face value because it was actually quantified. And you can just see where this is going. When you add in additional mixed bag parameters, you would, here's the example of the 10 micrograms per liter, you would use half that 10. And then you would use, because we're having to mix non-detects with detectable amounts or not totally explained, you would still have to use a half then. Because if you just inputted 0, it would skew your data. I guess that's, I'm no expert, and I'm sure the lab folks could tell you different, but that's my understanding of it. Anyway, and the last one is all the different combinations if you had all these examples in there. And again, this just basically shows how we process this information. And this is not new. This is how we've been doing it. We just haven't had it written down, and we haven't written it down in a format like in the CPP. And we're hoping it helps folks figure out what it is we're doing. Okay, and I know that seems brief, but as we discussed in the earlier session, if we do a side-by-side comparison, it's almost like apples and oranges, because just the way the current CPP is laid out and the draft CPP follows more of a narrative format with a thought process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jake for asking for questions and comments.
Jake, I've tried to unmute you, if you can hear me.
Hey, I'm sorry, everybody. But yeah, I guess we're at the point where we are going to do kind of the same thing we did in the morning hour, where if you would like to comment or have discussion, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we will get to you as they come up.
We got one with Sean.
Good afternoon. I'm Sean Simpson with GB Mack and Associates. I'm here today representing the Arkansas Environmental Federation. I had a couple of questions and one comment. The comment is this is the third stakeholder meeting for the CPP I've been involved with since sometime in the mid-1990s. I don't really remember for sure, but I just wanted to compliment the staff on the quality of the document they've produced. It's so far beyond what we started with 3 years ago that it makes it, the formatting makes a huge difference, the way it's laid out. I haven't read it word for word, but I did go through chapter 4 a little bit today, and it's just very straightforward and very easy to read, and the examples are great. So good work on that. Question, the BLM has been introduced to be used to adjust hardness-based metals criteria. And by the same token, the water effects ratio procedure is still in the document. And I'm just wondering about that and how those two are going to work together. And my basic issue is EPA has been extremely discouraging in the use of water effects ratios for the last couple of years. And in fact, I had a call from the planning section a couple of years ago, which indicated that water effect ratios would no longer be allowable in Arkansas. So I would like to know the thinking on the interplay between the BLM and the water effects ratio, and whether both are going to be allowed to be used. My other question, it has to do with the testing sensitivity. And I understand what that says, and the examples make it really easy to understand what it says, but I'm just wondering if, does this mean permittees should go shopping for a laboratory that only tests to this MQL required, and then indicates that if anything below that MQL is ND? Have you talked to any laboratories? I'm sure you've talked to your own laboratory, but some of the commercial laboratories that are doing testing for facilities that are regulated here in Arkansas. And those are both of my questions.
So Russell says he has a response to you regarding your first part, and then Russell.
Yeah, Sean, I think you know that EPA's guidance shifted in 2007 away from water effect ratios to the biotic living model. So therefore, that's been our guidance since 2007. States or an entity can do a water effect ratio, but if you do and do not look at all the parameters that would be covered by a biotic ligand model, when that's submitted to EPA, EPA will use its missing parameters document to actually run a BLM to determine if that water effect ratio is appropriate or within reason. And if they're fairly close, we're good with the WEIR, but if not, we'd recommend the BLM because that's the more scientifically defensive methodology.
Thank you, Russell, for that comment. Appreciate that. John, I think your other question had to do with testing sensitivity. And I think we lay out basic minimum requirements for MQLs in our forms and also in the CPP revisions. I really don't have a comment or recommendation on how the facilities should shop around for labs, and I don't think I'd want to touch that today. But I think all we're saying is the minimum sensitivities have to be met that we've outlined in our forms and documents. Did I capture that question, Sean, or maybe you had a more of a different angle on the question? You might want to expound.
No, Brian, that's my basic question, but I've just seen a lot of people that, that don't necessarily, understand the nuances of that particular requirement. And in some of the better labs they're very proud of their sensitivity, and they'll always report a number if they can quantify it, but it's not required. So it just seems to me like if it's below the MQL, you probably, I just wanted to be able to tell somebody, is it, if you just hit the sensitivity required, is it then acceptable to report it as not detected?
Carrie or Shane, do you want to speak to that so I don't misspeak?
I'm looking for Shane right now to unmute him.
Oh, okay, yeah, you can hear me. And I don't mean to put Penny on the spot, but I noticed that she is in on this call as well, and we can certainly. I would certainly be interested in her thoughts. I do know, just in the own history of this, so much of it has been a matter of it's not so much of, yeah, we want you to back up the quality of your work. It's just a matter of when we have quality of work all over the board and it has to meet a minimum, we just basically have to provide some way of saying this is how we deal with the data. And yeah, I guess it could be construed that we're kind of saying, hey, you don't have to be this high quality. That's not necessarily the intention, but I'm not quite sure how else we go about addressing that. Yeah, and I see Shane's available.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that if the lab has an ultra sensitive piece of equipment and they achieve lower than the MQL, then that meets our requirement. They've achieved the MQL, but at the same time, if they can accurately report, quantify a number, even if it's less than that required MQL, they should go ahead and report that number. More than likely, it will not show RP if they're reporting a number that's under the required MQL anyway. But you know, again, I don't know, nobody knows what each individual lab does and what each individual lab has as far as the equipment that they have. So we're just basically setting, here's the minimum requirements, you know, just make sure you meet those.
Penny, hey, Penny, did you have something that?
Well, I'm not very good at speaking off the cuff, but it seems to me, and I don't mean to stir up trouble, but it seems to me that reporting below the required MQL, I mean, I know that's, for example, in your examples earlier, the required MQL for zinc was 20. This lab achieved 10, but they reported 8. And that 8 is considered a J value because it is below their MQL. So it's considered estimated because it's below their low standard, but above their MDL. And when they report J values, we take them into account just as if they were non-estimated numbers. So it seems like it would be to the lab's advantage, not the lab, the permittee's advantage, if they did not report J values, anything below the required MQL. That's just a thought. I don't mean to stir up trouble, but it just, I don't see what advantage there is for them to be reporting any values below the required MQL. Are you going to kick me off? I'm just trying to understand.
We're in questions and comments, so you know nothing's carved in stone, and all very informational. So,
I mean, that sounded like a very reasonable response to me. This is Sean again, and you would think that if you get below the MQL, you're not going to end up with a reasonable potential, but I've seen plenty of examples of when a facility has gotten themselves a permit limit by reporting a number below the MQL. So I was just trying to clarify, should I be telling the permittee, yeah, just don't do that or not? And for the past 20 years, I've been telling them, just don't do that.
We can certainly make a note on those comments and questions to examine what we could add for further guidance when that case does come up, because I think it's a worthwhile question that's probably been asked over the years. So we will make that note.
Brian, this is long ago, but I know that it was just kind of viewed by some folks, regulators with DEQ way back. It's just kind of a gotcha thing. It's like, if they're not paying attention and they put down 8 when it should have been, ND because the MQL is 10, that's just on them, and that just doesn't seem particularly fair.
I would agree. I don't agree or subscribe to any gotcha tactics. So we'll take a look at it.
Thank you very much.
Is there
Colleen has a question.
There you go.
Hi, this is Colleen Gaston with Beaver Water District. And looking at these MQLs, on page 45 of the CPP, it says that the MQLs are based on 40 CFR section 136. And I haven't compared these. Are they identical to what's in the 40 CFR 136? That's my first question. And then my second question is, is how often will these MQLs be updated, in particular if the CFR numbers are changed?
So Carrie or Shane, can you remind me, are they identical to the CFR, or was there a different guidance document that had come out? I'm just trying to remember which. Are they published CFR numbers now?
I remember them as being what's in the 40 CFR in the 136, but that's my old brain thinking.
And I sure wouldn't guarantee that each single one is identical, because I thought there might have been one we had found that was not published, and we were scratching our head on that one.
Yeah, because it actually is included in EPA's form, but for some reason it was omitted in our PPS form, and we've been trying to reconcile that. That's still in the process. Matter of fact, you can't miss it. It's the one with the dash dash.
Yeah. But as far as updates, we follow and update our regs as needed to keep up with the CFR, 136 included. So we would have to make accommodations to update if the CFR were to be updated. Even if we had not gotten around to the CPP yet, we would at minimum update our PPS form and also our requirements for sensitivity if one were to become changed.
Yeah, can y'all hear me? This is Shane.
Yes, go ahead, Shane.
When you look through the list of approved test methods in 136, a lot of parameters have more than one test, more than one approved test method. So the MQLs that are in the CPP, listed in the CPP, would be the minimum MQL. For instance, there may be an approved test method that gets down that's more sensitive, but there's still an approved method that's out there in 136 that will that lines up with the minimum that we have stated. So there may be instances where you have an approved test method that's more sensitive, and that would be allowable to use, of course. So that's kind of where the MQL numbers came from. Is if you look at 136, they match up with what's in the MQLs match up with what's in 136 as far as I guess the least sensitive test method that's approved.
We have a question from the chat. Question on the reasoning for not including AIM implementation methods in the CPP per 130.5B6.
I'll take that. It's mainly a matter of preference and an unknown on the timeline and an unknown on the comments we may get or changes that may be needed. So we don't know that those two documents are going to track at the same rate as they make their way either to the public or to EPA. So although they could have been one and the same, everything included as part of the CPP, we chose to separate them, that each could potentially follow their own timeliness track.
Any other comments out there or questions? I got one. Russell with EPA.
Yeah, I just wanted to, mention that one thing. That was my question about 130.5B6, because that provision for the CPP. The CPP in general. One of the major parts or reasons for it is implementation of permits, and that particular site in the federal regs refers to implementation for water quality standards and schedules of compliance. But your anti-degradation implementation methods, they are implementation of one of the three portions of water quality standards. And that's why I raised that question as to whether they would be integrated or not. And I understand the timing issue as you're developing them, but going forward, a lot of places it makes sense to incorporate that directly into your CPP, because the point of part of the water quality standards reg revision was to ensure that the public had involvement in the process anytime you do a tier 2 review, which is required by reg anytime you issue a permit. That's all I need to say about that, I guess.
I would just say, I would just say I appreciate the comment, and perhaps those two plans would come together at some point at a later date. We just anticipated they could track differently, especially with one plan being very new, and that's the anti-deg being a very new thought process, and then the CPP being a very old and already in place process, we chose to keep them separated.
We got a comment, Justin,
Go ahead.
from Justin.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so kind of in the same vein as the previous questions, I'm looking on page 16 here of the draft CPP, table 1-1. Like, where would the anti-deg review occur in this table? I understand, like, it's a separate document, but, like, would it occur during the limits and permit conditions 30-day phase or another portion? So just kind of curious how that would work. It seems it would be helpful to spell out when the anti-deg review is actually occurring.
Yeah, no problem. And we will get into that in upcoming meetings, but I can certainly speak to it for a second today.
Sure.
That would occur by the applicant with permit submittal as part of the applicant's review and preparation of the filing for a permit or a permit modification, and then to be reviewed and rolled out as part of the draft decision-making process is where those decisions would take place. And we're going to walk through that with the next few meetings, the next 2 meetings, to hopefully to better explain how that process would work together.
All right, thanks.
Is there any other comments out there? Yes, Sean?
Thanks. I have a couple of flow-related questions where it's laid out on page 65 under the heading of 7Q10 stream flow and on through harmonic mean. And I don't think there's any change in anything here. Maybe harmonic mean equation wasn't in the old CPP, but it got me to thinking about the sentence that talks about a minimum of 10 years of daily stream flow data, and the way that 7Q10 typically works is if you've got 50, 60, 70 years of data, a lot of times that 7Q10 may be based on data during a stretch in 1942 or something, or 50s or 60s or 70s. And I'm just wondering, because we're going to be seeing such that it is changes in climate really creating different hydrology out there. And I wonder if it's a good idea if for a discharge situation where you have to calculate let's say you have to calculate the 7Q10 stream flow, should it be updated using the most 10 years, exclusively using the most recent 10 years of data as a better predictor of the next 5-year permitting cycle? Or would the preference still be to use all that 50 or 60 years of data? So there's that question. And then this is just a curiosity on my part. Where you have a known 7Q10, there's an equation given that you can estimate harmonic mean flow based on that known 7Q10 flow. And I'm just wondering if you've tested that equation on very many data sets, and if you have, does it hold, is it fairly accurate?
Well, I'll give a first stab at it, but I may need Shane to jump in as he's dealt with that quite a bit. I think using traditional methods to estimate something like 7Q10 would be a great first step, but if you've got data that points you into something at least significantly different, that should be evaluated, and at least the question as to why and is this a better representation should be asked about choosing the proper background flow. It would certainly be up to a case-by-case analysis and good decision making. So with that though, I had to talk to Shane or lean on him to discuss the additional question that was asked related to the formulas behind harmonic mean flow and so forth. Shane or Carrie, do you have any comment?
The harmonic mean flow is sometimes you can get that using the USGS StreamStats program. Sometimes it will not give you that. So it's really a case-by-case thing. We're traditionally, since StreamStats has come out, we've most of the time rely on the StreamStats program to get 7Q10s, and then there's also the study that was done by USGS. I believe it was 2008. I just call it the 7Q10 book, but it was a report that came out in 2008 that lists a lot of. They went through a lot of gauged and ungauged stations. And then for the gauge stations, there's an actual, published value of the 7Q10. It tells you the period of record, where the station's located, and all that. And then there's, I said gauged and ungauged. I meant continuous record and partial record stations. And then in the back of that book is the partial records station list, which they also give a 7Q10 value. So if the value can't be retrieved out of that book, if it's not in there, then the second option for 7Q10 would be to run a StreamStats on the actual discharge location and to see if that gives you a value. So those are basically two of the main options we use for 7Q10s, and then we certainly don't try to calculate the 7Q10 ourselves. We traditionally leave that up to USGS. And then there is a caveat, I guess, like the Delta region of the state, StreamStats equations have not been developed for the Delta region. So we have historically relied on the 1980s map from the Geological Commission for those. At this time, that's all we have. But your question on the harmonic mean, yeah, that's a good question. If you can get it with USGS StreamStats, that's usually a pretty scientifically defensible value. And then if not, yeah, there is an equation. You can estimate that using the 7Q10 value. And I guess that would be an option too. I don't know if that's discussed in this version of the CPP or not. I don't remember. I believe it is. Scroll down to that equation. Is that the equation you were referring to? Okay, yeah. So we discussed that. If you know the 7Q10 value, you can estimate the harmonic mean using that equation right there.
Thanks, Shane. My actual question was just whether you guys have taken USGS data sets and actually downloaded the data and calculated the harmonic mean flow using the equation that's shown in the CPP that you're looking at right now. And I'm sorry, using the actual equation for deriving a harmonic mean flow, and then have you tested that against the equation shown in 4.13233? I'm just does that equation give you a pretty accurate number based on comparing just a straightforward calculation of harmonic mean flow using the raw data? And perhaps you haven't done that.
Yeah, no, I have not done that.
Okay.
Like, just sit down and compare, just pick a site and try to compare them. No. Let's see. There is another. What is the equation above the section above that? What is that equation there?
It's that's the correct.
That's what you're referring to there. Just,
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know that's been done before. This equation. I remember doing one using this equation. Using the actual, daily flow data, and you may have 10,000, for example, values, and you go through with a spreadsheet and calculate out that harmonic mean. That's been done before, but as far as a comparison between using that equation that we're looking at versus the one below that, I'm not aware of any comparison that's been done.
Fair enough. Thanks, Shane.
Yeah.
Carpenter?
Am I unmuted? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
ma'am.
Okay. Hi. I'm going into something that I'm not sure I really fully understand what the results are going to be, but in the CPP on page 77, which has to do with nutrients, specifically total phosphorus, it basically says, let me find it, that under total phosphorus, all point source discharges into the watershed of waters officially listed on the 303D list for nutrients may be considered for discharge point limits based on Rule 2.509. And currently 2.509 has these weird, if you have a certain size facility, it's going to have so much phosphorus, and I personally think those limits are way too high anyway. But under the proposed Reg 2, I think you're jettisoning the numbers altogether, which goes to the question that was raised earlier this morning. How is all that going to interact? Because once you take those out, if you're looking at Reg 2.509, then you're just going back to the narrative criteria, establishing limits based on narrative criteria, which we all know has not gone well. And so that's my first question. How does that work? How's that going to work if you're successful in your Reg 2 where you take out those phosphorus limits? And 2, what will that do to existing permits? I assume that the existing permits that have total phosphorus limits, based on these weird, numbers, that they will nominally continue to have those numbers because of anti-backsliding, correct? Hello?
Yeah, I think anti-backsliding would be a primary first concern if those exist in a permit. So yes on that.
Okay. But the bigger question is, once you take those limits out that the number of permits are based on, and now you're only left with the narrative criteria for total phosphorus. How are you going to put total phosphorus limits? How are you even going to know if the monitoring and reporting are showing excessive nutrients based on total phosphorus if you only have narrative criteria? I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just throwing that out for people to be aware that this seems to be an issue that needs to be thought about.
I would say at least at minimum, your monitoring and reporting from your discharge would have to be compared against the actual activity of the stream and the effects on the stream as compared to your narrative criteria, if that's what remains. If we remain with a narrative, not a numeric criteria, we would have to rely on the status of the stream and condition on either impaired or not impaired. So that would be the first sort of thought process on that.
Well, there's a lot of factors that go into ensuring that you're in compliance with the total phosphorus narrative criteria.
I would
just pointing out this inconsistency, and that there's potentially a trap ahead.
I would not disagree. It's complex and comment noted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Going to the next, Colleen.
Yes, thank you. This is Colleen Gaston, and I'll just follow up briefly on the issue of nutrients. That it seems that this is a very limited and restrictive provision in the CPP, which, my understanding is that DQ is working on numeric nutrient criteria for promulgation. I mean, I guess maybe you can give us an update on that timeline, but sort of it falls back to a broader question of, it could be in here. I didn't see anything that talked about some sort of process for review and revision for this new version of the CPP once it is finalized. I mean, I don't think any of us want to wait 20 years before things are updated again. And so just this provision in particular highlights the fact that, things evolve fairly, can evolve more rapidly than over 20 years. And so what are your thoughts on how this will be updated? what are your thoughts for making the the nutrient provisions consistent with any changes to Reg 2? Actually, I'll just let you answer those questions.
My first thoughts on updating the CPP are there's no set standard or time frame set in the CFR, and that it discusses update the CPP as needed. It doesn't really give us a lot of guidance, but clearly, well, I would agree 20 years seems to be quite a bit too long. So surely it would need to be sooner than that. What was the other question?
Well, how are you going to factor up? I mean, you know there are going to be developments to the nutrient criteria and the water quality standards in Reg 2, I would assume, in the near future, or at least the future. So I guess, how are you going to allow for that in the CPP? And should there be something in the CPP that specifically says any changes to the water quality, Reg 6 or Reg 2, or maybe even Reg 5, that are more specific, more stringent, whatever, control over what's in the CPP?
No, that's a good point. And I think it is a given that the rules would have to be followed as they become effective, or changed and become effective. But if that's not clear, we should make a note on how that would be implemented. We could certainly add a comment on that.
Thank you.
Russell from EPA has, that is correct. There is no specific time frame, but there are no limitations to revising the portions of the CPP and EPA reviewing them periodically. Any other comments or questions? Sean.
Thank you. I have a question about ammonia permitting and the watershed size component that I understand is used at DEQ to make decisions about whether ammonia limits apply on a seasonal basis on watershed discharges to watersheds that are less than 10 square miles. I think I've got it's a fairly old policy memo that it's my understanding it's being used to permit ammonia now. And I didn't see anything. I haven't read it completely, but I did not see any kind of watershed size differentiation in the ammonia permitting. So is that, am I correct in the way I think it's working now? And is that intended to be continued into the future? And if so, does it need to be specified in the CPP?
Yeah, Sean, I know you and I have talked a little bit about that from time to time, and I'm not real sure the memo you're referring, but I don't expect any change at this time the way we're implementing ammonia, but with that question, I would also lean on Shane. Do you see any changes or have any comment regarding our current implementation of ammonia limits on the 10 square mile or less water body size?
No, it was intended just continue our current implementation, which I think the memo you're referring to, Sean, is maybe 2005 memo, something like that.
Probably it's got Martin Maynard, I think's names on it. Maybe Mo's name.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Shortly after that memo was written, there was a spreadsheet that was worked up that basically helps the permit engineers to implement the toxicity standards, to figure out what the toxicity value would be. And that's based on ecoregion. It's also based on whether it's a major or minor source classification. But then you're referring to the 10 square mile watershed. And I believe the current implementation is if it's less than 10 square miles at the discharge location, that's considered based on rule Reg 2 insufficient water for a fishery. So what happens is if it's less than 10 square miles, I believe the spreadsheet tells you that it's not a fishery during the critical season. So then what happens then is just whatever the dissolved oxygen model has for the effluent input, that's the number that's used to protect the DO standard. But that was intended to continue as currently being implemented. And we can certainly add that if it's not there in the draft. There may be a blurb, you may be missing it, I'm not sure, but there could be a statement in the draft CPP that addresses that.
Thanks. That answered my question. Thank you.
Well, before I got it out, here you come, Colleen.
Sorry, I'm going to go back. I think I asked this question and it was in a series of questions and I didn't get an answer to it, or maybe I didn't frame it really as a question, more as a presumption. But what is DEQ's schedule for rolling out numeric nutrient criteria? And again, I'm thinking about the section 4.15.6 on total phosphorus, just to know how to submit some comments on it. So what is the plan and schedule? I mean, my understanding was a couple years ago, basically most of the work had been done for some set of numeric nutrient criteria.
That's a good question. I would defer to members of our planning or Dr. Bland's for some thought on that, if they're in the meeting and available.
Nobody in planning is here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Bob. What we're doing, Colleen, I think as you know, we've collected the data. We're doing it by ecoregion. We've collected the data in the Boston Mountains and the Ozarks, and one other. I can't remember what it is now. And we're currently collecting the data for numeric nutrient criteria down in the Gulf Coastal Plain this year and next year. So we've got a few more ecoregions to go before we are able to come up with a statewide ecoregion-based standard. that's basically where we are.
So I thought the original idea was to go ahead and roll out the numbers for the Boston Mountain Ozark Highland or combined ecoregions before waiting for all these for any other ecoregion.
There was some discussion about that. The rationale was that we would publish one for one of the ecoregions, or maybe even what we call the Central Highlands, which includes a couple of them. But what we thought about, and did that as a test to see how we're going to administer this numeric number and how it's going to work in the permitting process. But we pretty much decided that that really is inequitable in terms of the permittees in that part of the state. And so we've decided that we're, at this point anyway, we're going to wait until we have all the data for the state.
Any other questions or comments? All right. We're going to go to Justin, and then Colleen, I'll come to you after Justin.
Yeah, this is Justin Stromlin with Arkansas Game and Fish. Kind of I guess a comment, and I wanted to sort of echo suggestions by some of the earlier speakers about either having some sort of like reopener clause or formal method of looking at the CPP every so often would be helpful. Like, I'll give an example here. I'm looking at section 1.8 on page 9 and 10. It's referring to 401 water quality certifications. And you guys have gone so far as to like define what WOTUSs are, and that's sort of a moving target between various lawsuits and the administration coming and going over the years. And so it may either be helpful to either like just reference WOTUS as whatever 404 is and not spell it out, or if it's going to change, maybe one or two administrations from now, again, not to like necessarily handcuff yourself to that, because like things like including only intermittent streams in there. Well, ephemeral streams were just removed from WOTUS, so if a lawsuit challenges that and they, ephemeral streams are back in, it's not necessarily spelled out there. So maybe like either not defining it there or just leaving it somewhat more nebulous may be helpful if that sort of thing changes. But yeah, just having the ability to kind of fix stuff like that every so often without having to go through a long process, or just defining when it is, I think would be helpful. So anyway, that's basically my comment.
I would just say that that is a very good point. And incidentally, WOTUS in that section was one of the last things we talked about not too many days ago. And it was highly considered of what we should do with that section for the time being. So point heard, and we will continue to think about that comment because I think it's a rational comment. And also point received that we will think about ways and how we revise the CPP going forward. It's a good point.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on the 401 certification, and Russell, you might can jump in here on this too. EPA just published a new, I think it's proposed rulemaking on 401 certifications for states, the steps that they will have to go through, and the timeframes that have to be adhered to for 401. And so that's all in the mill right now, and that's why this is kind of vague like it is, because we don't know where that's going to come out when that rule is final. Russell, can you add anything to that?
What you said is correct as far as 401, but let me step back for just a second on the waters of the U.S. That guidance speaks to federal jurisdiction. That does not control the state's jurisdiction. You can protect your waters however you so choose. That just speaks to federal jurisdiction. But you're correct on the 401 cert and the new guidance that is just coming out.
And the Arkansas definition of waters of the state is much more inclusive than the WOTUS definition. Even though,
as most states are, thank goodness.
So I have Colleen, Jesse, and Ellen, and I'm going to go in that order. Colleen?
So I guess Russell said what I was going to say, that the state can interpret their jurisdiction more broadly than for NPDES permitting even. And I think that should be noted in the document. I'm also, sorry, Bob, to do this to you. I'm going to jump back again on the nutrients issue, because this is very important for drinking water utility source water protection. So you said you were going to wait until you had all the numbers developed for all of the ecoregions. Your best estimate on what it is going to be.
yeah, what we were trying to do, I think it takes 2 years to do one ecoregion, and we're on number 4. So we've got, well, there are 6 ecoregions. So that pretty much is the timeline that it would take to get the rest of the data.
Okay. Can you give me a year, like calendar year? Again, this is just a best estimate.
Well, let's do it this way. We're in the 2nd year on the Gulf Coastal Plain, and we have 2 more ecoregions to go, if I count my ecoregions correct. And that would be 4 more years. So it would be sometime in 2025, maybe. Well, I don't know when the triennial review period would cycle into that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse?
Thanks, Colby. This is Jessie Green with White River Waterkeeper. I was, we just covered my questions. I was going to follow up specifically on the timelines with numeric nutrient criteria development, just making sure that I had heard that correctly. I guess my other comment would be that I know it's been mentioned by a few others earlier that it would definitely be helpful, probably even to have another stakeholder meeting specifically on the CPP. I know that there are 2 more plans specifically for anti-deg, which those will be great. And I think that today has been really helpful, but there are a lot of things that certainly need more review than I have been able to devote to this process, since we received these documents on the 16th. And yeah, and then just questions going back to total phosphorus again, as Ellen had mentioned, with the intent of removing that language from Reg 2 in regard to total phosphorus discharge limits corresponding to facility design flows. Has there been any discussion of if that language is removed from Reg 2, putting that into the CPP specifically?
I don't think we're proposing to remove that in this version of the reg that's going to the commission Friday. It's still in there.
Okay, that helps. I know that there had been discussion of it during the stakeholder meetings, but those were a while ago.
Thank you, Jesse. Ellen?
Hi, thank you. Well, first, Colleen and Jesse followed up on I was trying to find out exactly when that was going on, but when the nutrient criteria were going to be proposed. So you addressed that. But I looked at that draft Reg 2 just a second ago, and I don't know what I did with it. But I'm pretty sure all that language has been struck in 2.509. So I think
I'm looking at a red line. I'm looking at a red line version, and it's not struck.
on the, are you looking at the one that was filed? I looked at the one that was filed with the commission.
I don't. You know, I'm not sure if this is the one that was filed with the commission or not.
The one that was, the one I just looked at that was filed with the commission, Dr. Bland's, I saw strike through on 2.509. I'm pretty sure I did. Now I'm questioning it. You know what? I'll look it up again.
Ellen, I'm not positive and I'll check, but it's possible that some of that language could have been removed to Regulation 6.
Well, that would be an explanation, a logical explanation, but I don't have Reg 6 in front of me. So.
Yeah, I don't either, and I'm about to.
So that's
Or
I
at
mean,
least there was some consideration, and I don't know.
well, that was because
timing.
it's technically a permitting issue. It's not a water quality standard. And that's
Right.
why it makes sense for it to be in Reg 6. But all I know is it's coming out of Reg 2 and it's not in the CPP, but the CPP references the 2.509. So that's something we need to investigate.
Now that you mentioned that, Brian, I think that's right, that it went into Reg 6.
So it's in the draft Reg 6?
Yeah, let me double check.
Okay. Because, yeah, I'm looking again at pages 37 of 130 of the draft Reg 2 from the commission's website, or I'm sorry, ADP's website, and all of that struck. So let me see. Would this be in the current Reg 6? No.
No, it's been a proposed one that the public health turned down last week.
Okay.
Let's see.
It probably is in Reg 6. I mean, that's where it makes sense. Because it's not really a water quality standard. We need water quality standard, nutrient criteria. I'm not seeing Reg 6 on the draft reg, so I don't know what happened here.
Yeah, it's in Reg 6, 6.404 F.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. You were right, Ryan. I'd forgotten about that. Yep.
Yeah, I found it in the draft Reg 6 markup. It is, that language was moved to the draft Reg 6. I'm looking at it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. At least it's somewhere, but now you have the CPP referencing 2.509 rather than Reg 6. So I don't know if that makes any difference or not. I mean, it's what we, it will all be solved once we get nutrient criteria. I'll be solved for the best once we get nutrient criteria. I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll sort out the language on the location of that.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, I got Teresa Turk and then Ellen Carpenter.
Hi, Teresa Turk, Buffalo River Watershed Alliance. Yes, I would like to make sure that our next meeting, we still are on the CPP. I haven't had a chance to read this as thorough as I'd like to. And then there's also been quite a bit of good discussion and information today that I'd like to consider. So I would appreciate an additional meeting where we talk about the CPP. I also am concerned about the delay or the extended time period to where we develop numeric nutrient criteria. I think that's been a serious deficiency in the way we regulate our waters here in the state of Arkansas. So if there's any way to expedite that, where we can have certain ecoregions assessed and criteria created, numeric criteria created, I would really, really strongly encourage that to go down that path. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Alan.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say the same thing. I haven't had a chance to look at this CPP. It's a very, like I said, a long document. It's technical, and so I agree that it would be really helpful to have yet another meeting to discuss some of these meatier subjects that we can't get to because we haven't reviewed it all. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Colleen.
Yes, thanks, Colleen Gaston again. I'm not clear if a decision was made on the process for as we go along and come up with some things that we want to put in writing. One, just to clarify or for make it easier for DEQ to address questions. What is the process that we should follow? I know you had the link for submitting comments. So should any comments that we have be submitted to that? And then will you make those comments available to the rest of the group? Or how do you plan to do that? And I'm sorry if you've already answered this question. I'm just not clear on the process.
No, it's worthwhile question. The best way to submit a comment is through the email that we provided to sort of lay out the point and provide reasoning behind it. And that way it's clear for the record. This venue also is very good, but it's more of an open discussion. So if you've got a question or comments ready to put in the record, then writing them out is probably the best way, and send those to the email, the CPP-antideg email that we had provided.
And then how are those going to be posted for the group to access and see?
I believe it was our intent to provide comments as they're submitted. So we'll have to review those emails as they come in to determine which contain comments and which will be posted for the record, because like we had said, we're accepting comments and will be for a period. So they'll be part of a record. I presume to be posted on the webpage as they are processed. And I can't determine how long it takes to review and process those and get them on the webpage, but that's the initial plan.
Yeah, Brian, this is Carrie. We have, as I'm sure y'all are aware, we're recording this webcast right now. And from that, we're going to tease out the comments versus the questions. And we're going to consider those as submitted comments. We have scribes also that are taking notes and pulling that information. But I'm like you, I'm not quite sure how long it will take us to get that and condense it into comments. But we'll the intent is to post those back on the web page as soon as we can.
And I have provided a link to the email address in the middle of the screen. Well, it went away when on my screen.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see it.
I'll get it up there in just a moment.
Colby, are you putting something up, or are you?
Yes, I'm
wanting-
working on it. I'm working
Okay.
on it. Bear with me. Should be there now.
Did you also include that in the chat so they could cut and paste?
I will.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, I missed that one, Russell. Sorry about that. The document, Russell's question from EPA, the document on the page is titled Triennial Reg 2 Preliminary Discussion Draft. Is this going to the commission? Is that what's going to commission?
I'm not sure what copy you got, Russell. Did you get it off the commission's webpage?
Russell, I'm unmuting you.
No, Bob, I didn't get it off the commission's webpage. I got it off of DEQ's.
Okay, you probably need to go to the commission webpage and pick a, it'll be an appendix to the agenda item for this Friday.
Okay, I'll get it. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any other comments or questions?
So just a reminder, we've got this email. If you have comments, you may send them in, or questions. Feel free, and we'll respond as soon as we can to those questions. But if there are not any more discussion points, comments, questions, or other items for discussion,
Got one.
I see one popping up.
Colleen.
So for scheduling purposes, the meeting on the 7th, I think maybe someone said it was in the morning, but do you know the exact time just so we can get this on our calendars? The same thing for the one on the 21st. It would be helpful to know.
I don't think it's scheduled at the moment. It's currently set for, no, it's not. Carrie, it's not scheduled yet, is it, other than holding the date?
Correct. I was checking on that as well. And was this the 7th meeting? Was that the one where there was a preference for the morning or the afternoon?
Right, the one on the 7th that would potentially conflict in the afternoon with the EPA's webinar.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have that. We'll have that up as soon as we put our heads together, and just the fact that there's some additional comments or opportunity for comments for the CPP. And again, that's not to say that the CPP can't, you know, comments and questions can't be inputted any time during this whole process. It's just that the CPP is long, but not a lot of substantial changes. The anti-deg is short, but all new. And so that one's going to be actually, the way it's going to be presented is kind of line by line. And so that's going to be a more arduous process. But again, that's not to say that we can't just insert some time for CPP. I especially wanted people to kind of know what was coming up, just so that if you have a vested interest in anti-deg, you know when to show up, as opposed to the CPP where, you know, you might not have a dog in that fight.
So any more questions, comments? If there are not any more, like I said, we're available to email in. Please let us know. But otherwise, if there's no more questions or comments for today, we're going to conclude the discussion, and we'll be releasing more information and posting more on the website as we process that. And when we get the meetings scheduled for July 7th or other options, we will be letting the group know. And we'll have that information also on our webpage. And with that, I will, unless there's any further comments by Dr. Blands or Kobe or Jake or any of the group, Carrie, I'm gonna call last call for that. Otherwise, I'm gonna conclude the meeting today. All right, well, I appreciate everyone for participating. And like I said, we'll be announcing more information as it becomes available. Thank you all.